The music stopped the moment Damon walked through the doors with another woman on his arm. Elena felt it before she understood it. A cold drop through her chest, sudden and sharp, like stepping on a stair that isn't there. She was standing near the long window with a glass of wine she hadn't touched, and she watched her husband enter the ballroom of the Ashwood Pack, with a stranger's hand resting on his sleeve. The woman was beautiful, in the practiced way of someone who had learned exactly how to stand under chandeliers. Dark hair pinned up, a green dress that caught the light, a smile aimed at every wolf in the room except the one it should have been aimed at. Damon didn't look nervous. That was the part Elena noticed most. He looked like a man arriving at his own party, comfortable, sure of himself, sure that whatever came next would go his way. Elena had known about Vera for 6 months. She had smelled her on his coat once, faint and floral, and said nothing. She had heard her name in a hallway once, spoken low between two betas who stopped talking the second they saw her. She had built a whole silence around it, brick by brick, and she had lived inside that silence long enough to believe it was a kind of peace. It was not peace. She understood that now, standing in her dress with her wineglass sweating in her hand, watching Damon guide Vera toward the center of the room like she belonged there. The pack ball was the one night a year when every wolf family in the region gathered under one roof. Rival packs sat at the same tables. Old enemies exchanged polite words over champagne. It was supposed to be a night of alliances, of careful smiles, of nothing going wrong. Elena had worn this same green-gold dress for 3 years running. She had learned to enjoy the ache in her feet by the end of the night, because it meant the night was almost over. This year, the ache started before the dancing had even begun. "Everyone, I want you to meet someone," Damon said, his voice carrying over the low hum of conversation. He said it easily, the way he said everything, like the words cost him nothing. "This is Vera. She's a guest of the pack tonight." A guest of the pack. Elena turned the words over in her mind, the way she might turn over a stone to see what was living underneath it. She counted the buttons on her own sleeve instead of looking at her husband's face. 6 buttons. She counted them again. Still 6. Across the room, several of the older wolves went still in that particular way that only wolves go still, a stillness that has nothing to do with calm and everything to do with catching a scent that doesn't match the story being told. Elena felt eyes move toward her, quick and careful, the way people look at a crack in the ice before deciding whether to step onto it. She smiled instead. It was not a large smile. It did not need to be. It was the kind of smile that told the room she had heard the introduction, understood exactly what it meant, and had decided, for tonight at least, not to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her come apart. Her best friend Nora appeared at her elbow within seconds, her own glass of wine already half gone. Nora had grown up 2 houses down from Elena, back when they were both pups running through the same muddy fields, and she had never learned to hide her feelings the way Elena had. "You knew," Nora said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I knew," Elena said. "And you didn't say anything. What was there to say?" Nora studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that used to make Elena confess things when they were young. It didn't work anymore. Elena had gotten good at holding her face together like a piece of pottery glued from the inside, seamless on the surface, cracked everywhere no one could see. "He's your mate," Nora said. "This isn't supposed to happen to mates." Elena almost laughed at that. Almost. The mate bond was supposed to be sacred, unbreakable, a thread tying 2 wolves together for life. Everyone said it like it was a guarantee of happiness, a promise carved into the bone. No one ever mentioned that a bond could hold 2 people together and still leave one of them completely alone. "Apparently it happens anyway," Elena said, and took her first real drink of the wine. Across the room, Damon was laughing at something Vera had said, his head tilted back just slightly, the way he used to laugh at Elena's jokes in the first year of their bond, before the pack meetings multiplied and the late nights multiplied with them. Elena watched the laugh and felt nothing where she expected to feel pain, which somehow frightened her more than the pain would have. The orchestra began again, a slow piece meant to draw couples onto the floor. Damon's hand found the small of Vera's back with an ease that suggested this was not the first time it had rested there. He guided her toward the dancing without once glancing toward his wife. Elena set her wineglass down on the tray of a passing server and walked toward the terrace doors, needing air that didn't taste like betrayal. The terrace was cooler and quieter, and mostly empty except for a small cluster of wolves from a neighboring pack talking business near the railing. Elena leaned against the stone balustrade and looked out over the dark garden, listening to the muffled music behind her, trying to remember how to breathe in a way that didn't feel like work. "You looked like you needed to leave that room," a voice said behind her. She turned. A tall man stood a few feet away, dark-haired, dressed in black instead of the bright colors most of the guests wore, like he had decided early in life that he didn't need bright colors to be noticed. She recognized him immediately, the way anyone in the Ashwood territory would recognize him. Kai Thorne, heir to the Black Ridge Pack, the Ashwood Pack's oldest rival, invited tonight only because tradition demanded a seat be offered even to your enemies, so that no one could claim the peace had been broken by exclusion. "I'm fine," Elena said, which was a lie so old and so practiced it barely felt like one anymore. Kai didn't argue with her. He didn't smile the polite, empty smile that everyone else in that ballroom had perfected. He simply looked at her, steady, unhurried, like he had all night and no interest in wasting a second of it on pretending. "You don't have to be fine out here," he said. "Nobody's watching." Elena almost told him he was wrong, that somebody was always watching, that watching was the entire architecture of pack life. Every glance logged and weighed and turned into gossip by morning. Instead, she said nothing, and the silence between them stretched out comfortably, which surprised her more than anything else that night. "I saw the introduction," Kai said after a moment. "Not cruel, not pitying, just honest, the way a person states a fact about weather." "Everyone saw it," Elena said. "I'm sorry." 2 words. He didn't dress them up. He didn't explain them or soften them with something else. He simply set them down between them like a stone on a table, and Elena found that she was grateful for the plainness of it, grateful that at least one person tonight wasn't performing. "Don't be," she said. "It's not your mate." "No," Kai agreed, "but it's still a hard thing to watch happen to someone." Elena studied him then, really looked at him for the first time in years, longer than the polite 3 seconds pack etiquette allowed when observing a rival's heir. He had a stillness to him that reminded her of deep water, the kind that looks calm on the surface because it's too deep for the wind to disturb it. She wondered, briefly and uselessly, what it would be like to be looked at by someone who wasn't already looking past her toward the next thing on his schedule. Inside, the music shifted again, rising into something livelier, and a ripple of laughter drifted out through the open doors. Elena thought of Damon's hand on Vera's back and felt the cold drop return to her chest, sharper this time, less surprising and somehow worse for it. "Would it help?" Kai said slowly, like he was testing the shape of the words before he offered them. "If you didn't spend the whole night pretending you didn't feel anything." Elena raised an eyebrow. "What would you suggest instead?" "A dance," Kai said. "One that has nothing to do with alliances or politics or your husband." It was a simple offer, and a dangerous one. A dance between the alpha's mate and the heir of a rival pack was never simple, not in a room full of people trained to read meaning into every gesture. Elena knew this. She knew it the way she knew her own name, the way she knew the weight of the ring on her finger. She also knew, standing on that terrace with the cold air on her shoulders and her husband's laughter still ringing faintly behind her, that she was tired of being the only person in her own marriage who followed the rules. "One dance," she said. Kai held out his hand, and Elena looked at it for a long moment before she took it, feeling something shift inside her chest that she did not yet have a name for, something that felt less like betrayal and more like the first breath after holding your air too long underwater. His hand was warm and steady and did not tremble the way her own fingers had trembled all evening. She let him lead her back toward the terrace doors, not into the ballroom itself, but along the edge of it, where a smaller space had been cleared for guests who wanted to dance without the crowd pressing in on every side. Nora caught her eye across the room as they passed, and her expression shifted from concern to something closer to alarm. Elena gave her the smallest shake of her head, a signal the two of them had used since childhood, one that meant, "Let me have this, don't ask yet." Nora's mouth tightened, but she stayed where she was, wine glass forgotten in her hand. The orchestra had slowed again, the earlier lively piece giving way to something older and quieter, the kind of music meant for couples who had nothing left to prove to anyone in the room. Kai placed one hand at her waist, light, careful, asking permission with the pressure of his palm rather than assuming it. Elena rested her hand on his shoulder and felt the solid line of muscle beneath the black fabric, felt how still he held himself even as they began to move. They did not speak at first. The silence between them was different from the silence she carried around Damon, lighter somehow, less like a weight, and more like a held breath before laughter. Elena found herself watching the small details of him, instead of searching the room for her husband's face, the way his jaw set when he concentrated, the faint white scar along his left eyebrow that she had never noticed from a distance. "You dance like someone who learned from a very strict teacher," she said, if only to fill the space with something other than her own racing thoughts. "My mother," Kai said. She believed a wolf who couldn't hold a proper frame in a ballroom couldn't be trusted to hold anything else steady either. That's a strange philosophy. She was a strange woman. I mean that as a compliment. Elena almost smiled. A real one this time, small and surprised at itself. She had forgotten, somewhere in the last several years, what it felt like to have an ordinary conversation with someone who wasn't measuring every word for what it might cost him politically. Across the room, she felt rather than saw Damon's attention shift. It was a small thing, a change in the air the way a forest goes quiet before a storm arrives, and Elena did not need to turn her head to know that her husband's eyes had finally found her, that he was no longer laughing at whatever Vera had said, that for the first time all evening he was watching his wife instead of being watched himself. Elena kept her gaze on Kai's collar and did not look toward the sound of that sudden, heavy silence. Whatever expression was on Damon's face right now, she decided she did not need to see it to know what it meant. Let him feel, for once, the particular cold that came from being the one left standing outside a closed door. The song moved on without hurry, and so did they, turning slowly beneath the chandeliers, while the rest of the ballroom carried on its business around them, oblivious to the quiet current running beneath the surface of one single dance. The song ended, but neither of them stepped back right away. Elena felt the absence of music settle over the small cleared space, like a held breath, and for a moment she and Kai simply stood there, his hand still resting at her waist, hers still resting on his shoulder, as if pulling apart too quickly would announce something neither of them wanted announced. Around them the ballroom noise rushed back in, laughter and glasses and the low hum of 30 conversations happening at once, and Elena realized with a small jolt that she had not thought about Damon for the entire length of that song. That realization frightened her more than anything Vera's arrival had managed to do. "Thank you," she said, stepping back at last, smoothing the front of her dress with hands that were no longer trembling. "For what?" Kai asked. "The dance was my idea. For not asking me anything I didn't want to answer." Something flickered across his face then, brief and unreadable, gone before she could name it. "I find people usually answer more when you don't ask," he said. "You could have told me to leave you alone on that terrace. You didn't. I might regret that." "You might," he agreed, without a trace of apology in his voice. "Regret is a luxury for people who had other options." Elena wanted to ask him what he meant by that, wanted to press further into the strange, steady calm radiating off him like heat from a low fire, but movement at the edge of her vision caught her attention, and she turned to see Damon crossing the floor toward them with the particular walk of a man trying very hard to look like he wasn't hurrying. "Elena." His voice was even, controlled, the voice he used in pack meetings when he wanted to appear reasonable while making it clear he was not in a reasonable mood. "I didn't realize you'd left the main floor." "I didn't realize you'd noticed," Elena said. A muscle moved in his jaw. Beside her, Kai said nothing, made no move to step away, simply stood there with the same unbothered stillness he'd worn on the terrace, as if Damon's arrival was a minor weather event rather than the confrontation the whole room now seemed to be holding its breath for. "Kai," Damon said, and the name came out of him like something distasteful he was obligated to swallow. "I didn't know Blackridge sent its heir to dance with married women. I didn't know Ashwood sent its alpha's guests to dance with everyone except his wife," Kai said, mild as still water, and Elena felt something in her chest loosen at the exact moment Damon's expression tightened. "That's not the same thing, isn't it?" The two men studied each other with the specific, ancient hostility of packs that had shared a border and a grudge for longer than either of them had been alive, a hostility that had nothing to do with tonight and everything to do with tonight, both at once. Elena had grown up hearing stories about the feud between Ashwood and Blackridge, land disputes generations old, a betrayal buried so deep in pack history that nobody alive could say for certain anymore who had wronged whom first. She had never expected to find herself standing in the middle of it, quite literally, at her own husband's side. "Excuse us," Damon said finally, and it wasn't a request. His hand found Elena's elbow, not rough, but not gentle either, the grip of a man reasserting a claim rather than offering comfort. Elena let herself be steered a few steps away, out of Kai's immediate hearing, though she doubted the distance mattered much to wolves whose senses could pick out a whispered conversation across a crowded room if they cared enough to listen. "What was that?" Damon asked, low and tight. "A dance," Elena said. "You should try one sometime. I hear they're traditional at balls." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Enjoy myself for 5 minutes, while you paraded your guest around the dance floor in front of everyone we know." Damon's jaw worked, and for a moment Elena thought he might actually say something honest, something that wasn't measured, or careful, or designed to manage the optics of the room around them. Instead, he glanced past her, toward Kai, and his voice dropped even further. "He's not someone you should be seen with. Not like that, not tonight." "Funny," Elena said. "I don't remember you asking my permission before you introduced Vera to the entire pack as your guest." Damon flinched, actually flinched, a small motion at the corner of his eye that told her the shot had landed even if he refused to admit it out loud. For one strange moment, Elena almost felt sorry for him, almost reached out the way she used to when they were newly bonded, and every disagreement felt survivable. Then she remembered his hand on Vera's back, the easy laugh, the introduction that had made the whole room go still, and the impulse passed as quickly as it had come. "We'll talk about this later," Damon said. "Not here." "We never talk about anything later," Elena said. "That's sort of the problem." She turned before he could answer and walked back toward the edge of the dance floor, aware of eyes following her, aware of Nora's worried face somewhere in the crowd, aware most of all of the strange lightness in her own chest, as if something that had been folded too tightly for months had finally been given room to breathe. Kai was gone by the time she looked for him, though she caught a glimpse of him near the far doors a few minutes later, in conversation with 2 older wolves from his own pack, his posture as unreadable as ever. He didn't look toward her, and somehow that felt like its own kind of consideration, a refusal to make things harder than they already were. The rest of the evening passed in a strange, suspended way, as if Elena were watching it from slightly outside her own body. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and didn't drink it. She spoke to the wife of a beta from a neighboring territory about nothing in particular, some story about a garden that needed replanting, and heard almost none of it. She watched Damon return to Vera's side across the room, watched him laugh again at something she said, and found that the sight no longer produced the same cold drop in her chest it had earlier. It produced something closer to distance, as though she were reading about someone else's marriage in a letter that had arrived very late. Near midnight, the crowd began to thin. Carriages and cars called for. Farewells exchanged with the particular warmth that only comes after several hours of wine. Elena found Nora near the coat check, already wrapped in her shawl, watching her with an expression that mixed worry and something like awe in equal measure. "You're different tonight," Nora said. "I don't mean that as an insult." "I don't know what I am tonight," Elena admitted, and it was the truest thing she had said all evening. "That man, Kai Thorne. Do you know what you're doing?" Elena thought about the terrace, the warmth of his hand at her waist, the plainness of his apology, the way he had not once tried to make her feel foolish for accepting his offer. She thought about Damon's flinch, small and involuntary, the first honest thing he had shown her in longer than she could remember. "No," she said, "but for the first time in a long time, I think I want to find out." Outside, the night air was cold and clean, and as Elena stepped into the car that would take her home, she caught one last glimpse of the ballroom through the tall windows, gold light spilling out across the gravel drive, Damon's silhouette still visible near the doors, Vera's laughter still faintly audible even from this distance. She did not look away out of sadness. She looked away because, for the first time in longer than she could name, she had somewhere else her thoughts wanted to go, and it was not toward the marriage she had spent years trying to hold together with silence and good behavior. The car pulled away from the Ashwood estate, gravel crunching beneath the tires, and Elena rested her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the dark trees slide past, feeling the shape of the evening settle into something she did not yet fully understand, but no longer feared the way she once might have. Somewhere behind her, in the golden light of the ballroom she had left, the whispers had already begun, moving from ear to ear like smoke, finding every gap in a closed room, carrying the story of the alpha's mate and the enemy's heir out into the pack before the night was even finished. By morning, everyone would know, and by morning, Elena would have to decide exactly how much of what happened at that ball she was willing to let define her next. She did not fall asleep easily that night. The house felt too large and too quiet after the noise of the ballroom, every creak of the old floorboards magnified in the stillness. She sat by the window of the bedroom she still, technically, shared with Damon, watching the long driveway for the sweep of headlights, and told herself she was only waiting because it would look strange not to. It was nearly 2 in the morning when the car finally arrived. Elena heard the engine cut off, heard the low murmur of a driver's voice, heard Damon's footsteps on the gravel path, slower than usual, heavier, the walk of a man carrying something he didn't want to set down in front of anyone. She did not go downstairs to meet him. She stayed where she was, arms wrapped around her knees, and waited to see if he would come to her at all. He did, eventually, pausing in the doorway of the bedroom with his jacket already off, his collar loosened, his eyes finding her in the dark before he'd even reached for the light. "You're still awake," he said. "I couldn't sleep." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, not touching her, keeping a careful distance that felt more like habit than choice. For a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching out between them the way it had stretched out for months now, comfortable to no one but familiar enough to bear. "I didn't plan for it to happen the way it did tonight," he said finally, bringing her. "I should have told you first." "You should have told me a lot of things first," Elena said. 6 months ago would have been a good start." Damon's shoulders dropped slightly, and for one unguarded second he looked less like the alpha of Ashwood and more like the boy she had bonded with years ago, uncertain, human, in a way he rarely allowed himself to be in front of anyone. "I don't know how to explain what happened between us," he said. "The bond is still there. I feel it every time you're in the room. I just don't know how to feel it and still want other things too." "That's not an explanation," Elena said. "That's a confession. Maybe it's both." She turned to look at him then, really look, searching his face for some sign of the man she had chosen, or been chosen for, all those years ago. She found traces of him still, in the set of his jaw, in the tired lines around his eyes, but something essential had shifted, some foundation stone quietly removed while she wasn't looking, and she wondered how long it had been gone before she'd finally noticed the house was leaning. "Kai Thorne," Damon said, changing direction the way he always did when a conversation grew too close to something he didn't want to hold. "Do you understand what people will say about tonight?" "Let them say it," Elena replied. "They were already saying things about Vera. I don't see why my name should stay clean while yours gets to collect whatever it wants." "It's not the same," Damon said again, quieter this time, almost pleading. "He's Blackridge. There's history there you don't understand." "Then explain it to me," Elena said. "For once, explain something to me instead of deciding I don't need to know." Damon opened his mouth, then closed it again, and in that silence Elena understood that whatever history existed between Ashwood and Blackridge, whatever old wound made her husband flinch at the mention of Kai's name, it was a wound he had no intention of showing her tonight, or perhaps ever. He reached for her hand instead, an old habit, a peace offering worn smooth from years of use, and Elena let him take it without quite deciding to. "I still choose you," he said. "Whatever else is happening, I still choose you." Elena looked down at their joined hands, his fingers rough and familiar around hers, and felt the strange hollow ache of hearing words that once would have meant everything and now landed somewhere just short of enough. "Choosing me while keeping her close isn't choosing me," she said quietly. "It's just choosing not to lose either one of us. That's different." Damon had no answer for that, and after a while he let go of her hand and lay down beside her without another word, his back to her, his breathing slow, and even within minutes, in the particular way of a man who had learned to sleep through his own guilt. Elena stayed sitting upright a long while longer, watching the dark shape of him, listening to the wind move through the trees outside, and thinking, against every instinct of loyalty she had been raised on, of a warm hand steady at her waist and a voice that had not once asked her to pretend she felt nothing. By the time Elena came down for breakfast, the story had already traveled further than she could have imagined. She heard it first in the kitchen, where two of the household staff went quiet the moment she entered, their conversation cutting off mid-sentence in a way that told her exactly what subject they had been discussing. She heard it again outside, where a delivery boy from the village lingered, a beat too long at the gate, staring at her with open curiosity, before catching himself and hurrying off. By midday, when she walked into the small market square to clear her head, she felt eyes following her, the way rain follows a cloud, quiet, constant, impossible to outrun. Wolves talked. It was simply what they did, whispers moving from ear to ear at a speed no ordinary gossip could match, carried on something closer to instinct than words. By nightfall, every pack within 3 territories would know that the alpha's mate had danced with the Blackridge heir at the very same ball where the alpha had introduced his mistress to the room. Elena understood, walking home with her basket half empty and her nerves stretched thin, that she had become a story before she had even decided what she wanted the story to mean. Nora found her in the garden that afternoon, sitting on the old stone bench beneath the oak tree where they used to trade secrets as children. She dropped down beside her without an invitation, the way only a lifelong friend could, and studied Elena's face for a long moment before speaking. "They're calling it the dance heard round 3 packs, Nora said. "I thought you should hear it from me, instead of from someone trying to make you feel small about it." "Wonderful," Elena said flatly. "I always wanted to be famous for something." "You're not being fair to yourself. You didn't do anything wrong." "Tell that to the entire Ashwood territory." Nora reached over and took her hand, squeezing it once, firm and grounding, the same gesture she had used since they were pups falling out of trees together. "What happened with Kai?" she said carefully. "Was it just the dance? Or is there more you haven't told me?" Elena considered the question longer than she meant to. She thought of the warmth of his hand at her waist, the plain honesty of his apology, the strange lightness that had filled her chest for the length of one song and refused to fully leave since. She thought of Damon's hollow promise in the dark, the words "I still choose you" landing, like something already worn through at the seams. "I don't know yet," she admitted, but it felt like the first true thing that's happened to me in years. Nora didn't judge her for that. She simply nodded, slow and thoughtful, the way she always had, and let the silence between them do the rest of the talking. The whispers followed Elena for 3 more days, growing rather than fading, each retelling adding some new detail that had never actually happened. By the 3rd day, the story claimed she and Kai had disappeared onto the terrace for over an hour, that Damon had nearly challenged him on the spot, that Vera had wept openly in the coat room when she heard the news. None of it was true, but Elena had learned long ago that truth rarely slowed a rumor down once it had gathered enough speed. It was on the 4th day that Vera found her. Elena had gone into the village to collect a package at the small post office near the square, a task simple enough that she hadn't bothered bringing anyone with her. She was standing near the counter, waiting for the clerk to locate her parcel, when she felt someone stop just behind her shoulder, close enough that the floral scent she remembered from Damon's coat filled the small space between them. "Elena," Vera said, "do you have a moment?" Elena turned slowly, keeping her face as still as she could manage. Up close, without the chandeliers and the green dress and the careful lighting of the ballroom, Vera looked younger than Elena had expected, and more tired, faint shadows beneath her eyes that no amount of careful makeup could fully hide. "I don't think we have anything to say to each other," Elena said. "Please," Vera said, and there was something in her voice that surprised Elena, a rawness that didn't match the confident woman who had walked into the ball on Damon's arm like she owned the room. "Just 5 minutes, outside, if you'd rather not be seen with me in here." Against her better judgment, Elena followed her out through the side door of the post office into the narrow alley behind the shops, where the noise of the square faded into something more private. Vera wrapped her arms around herself, though the day was warm, and it took her a long moment to find her words. "I know what you must think of me," Vera said finally. "I try not to think of you at all," Elena said, though it wasn't entirely true. Vera flinched at that, and for a moment Elena almost regretted the sharpness of it. Almost. "Damon told me things were already over between the two of you," Vera said. "In every way that matters. That's what he said, word for word. I believed him. I wanted to believe him, if I'm honest, because it made everything easier to live with." Elena felt something tighten behind her ribs, a familiar cold pressure that had nothing to do with Vera, and everything to do with the man who had made that claim to 2 different women and called it love with both of them. She said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and the silence stretched long enough that Vera eventually filled it herself. "I'm not trying to make excuses," Vera continued. "I know how it looks. I know what I let myself become part of, but I need you to understand that I didn't know I was standing in the middle of someone else's marriage, not the way you must think I did." "And now?" Elena asked quietly. "Now that you know." Vera's jaw tightened, and for the first time since the conversation began, something like real emotion broke through the careful composure she had walked in with. "Now I don't know what I'm supposed to do with what I know," she said. "I care about him. I'm not going to lie about that to make this easier for either of us. But I also don't want to be the reason a mate bond falls apart. That's not who I want to be." Elena studied her for a long moment, searching for the easy villain she had built in her mind over the past 6 months of silence, the woman who existed only to steal something that belonged to someone else. She found instead a person, flawed and lonely, and caught in a story she hadn't fully understood the shape of until it was already too large to walk away from cleanly. "He told me you 2 were nearly finished," Vera said again, quieter this time, almost pleading. "I need to know if that was ever true." Elena thought of the last real conversation she had shared with Damon before the 6 months of silence began, a conversation so ordinary and forgettable that she couldn't even remember the specific words of it now, only the feeling of 2 people occupying the same house without occupying the same life. She thought of the ring on her finger, heavier some days than others. She thought of a warm hand at her waist on a terrace, steady and asking nothing in return. "I don't know what was true anymore," Elena said honestly. "I don't think I've known for a long time." Vera nodded slowly, as if that answer, incomplete as it was, had told her something important anyway. She didn't apologize again, didn't ask for forgiveness or absolution, simply stood there for another quiet moment before turning to leave the way she had come. "For what it's worth," she said, pausing at the mouth of the alley, "I'm sorry it happened the way it did. Publicly. In front of everyone. You deserved better than an introduction in a crowded ballroom." Elena watched her go, the green dress from the night before replaced now by something plain and unremarkable, the confident posture from the ball folded away into something smaller and more careful. She stood in the narrow alley a long while after Vera had disappeared around the corner, turning the conversation over in her mind, surprised to find that her anger had nowhere obvious left to land. That evening, at dinner, Damon asked about her day in the careful, distant way he had adopted since the ball, as though testing the temperature of water before deciding whether to step in. Elena told him about the delivery boy at the gate, about the whispers in the market square, about the growing story that seemed to gain a new detail every time it changed hands. She did not tell him about Vera. Some conversations, she had decided, belonged only to the women who'd had them, not to the man who had made them necessary in the first place. Later that night, alone in the study that had once belonged to her grandmother, a small room tucked away from the rest of the house where Elena kept the few things that were truly hers, she found herself thinking not of Damon, and not entirely of Vera either, but of a single sentence Kai had spoken on the terrace, plain and unhurried. "Regret is a luxury for people who had other options," she wondered, staring at the fire in the small hearth until it burned down to embers, whether she had ever truly had other options, or whether she had simply never let herself look for them until a stranger in black had given her permission to try. The pack, she knew, was still watching, still whispering, still shaping her into whatever story served their curiosity best. But for the first time since she had watched Damon walk through those ballroom doors with Vera on his arm, Elena felt less like a woman caught inside someone else's decisions, and more like a woman beginning, slowly and carefully, to make her own. She thought of her 17th year, the year the pack elders had chosen Damon for her before she had been old enough to understand what a bond truly cost, and for the first time in a long while she let herself feel the old, familiar anger that came with that memory, not sharp anymore, but steady, like a coal that had never quite gone out beneath the ash. The following morning, Damon left before sunrise for a meeting with the pack's senior council, a meeting Elena had not been told about until she noticed the empty space on his side of the bed and the note left on the kitchen table in his quick, slanted handwriting. She did not need to guess what the meeting concerned. She had lived inside pack politics long enough to know that a dance at a ball did not stay a private matter for long, not when it involved a rival heir and an alpha's mate in the same breath. She learned the details later that day from Nora, who had her own sources inside the council, mostly older women who trusted her because she asked good questions and kept most of what she heard to herself. According to Nora, 3 of the senior elders had raised concerns about the appearance of the dance, worried less about Elena's feelings and more about what it might signal to Blackridge, whether Ashwood looked weak, whether old wounds between the two packs were being reopened by something as simple as a few minutes on a dance floor. "They're treating it like a border dispute," Nora said, shaking her head over a cup of tea in Elena's kitchen, "as if you were negotiating territory instead of just dancing. Everything is a border dispute to men who've spent their whole lives guarding one," Elena said. "Damon defended you at least, from what I heard." Elena looked up at that, surprised despite herself. "Defended me how?" "Told the council the dance meant nothing, that you'd simply been polite to a guest, that there was no need to treat it as an incident." Nora paused, studying Elena's face carefully. He didn't sound like a man who believed his own words, if that's worth anything. It was worth something, Elena supposed, though she couldn't have said exactly what. It didn't undo the 6 months of silence, didn't erase the image of Vera's hand resting easily in the crook of his arm, didn't answer the deeper question of whether a man could defend a woman in council and still be quietly relieved, somewhere in his chest, if she walked away entirely. But it was something, a small stone placed carefully on a scale that had tipped so far in one direction, Elena had almost stopped weighing it at all. That evening, walking the perimeter path that circled the edge of the estate, a habit she had kept since childhood whenever her thoughts grew too loud to sit still with, Elena found herself replaying the conversation with Vera from 3 days earlier. She thought of the tired shadows beneath Vera's eyes, the rawness in her voice when she spoke of not wanting to be the reason a bond fell apart. It would have been easier, Elena thought, to hate her cleanly, to build her into a villain sturdy enough to carry all of the blame. But people rarely built themselves to fit the shapes that made life simpler for everyone around them, and Vera, it turned out, was no exception. The path curved near the old stone wall that marked the boundary between Ashwood Land and the wider forest beyond, and Elena paused there, resting her hand against the cool, moss-covered stone, listening to the wind move through the high branches above her. It was here, as a much younger woman, that she had once imagined a different life for herself, before the elders had chosen Damon, before the bond had settled over her like a decision made without her ever being asked to vote. She wondered, standing in the same spot years later, whether that younger version of herself would recognize the woman she had become, or whether she would simply ask why it had taken so long to start asking questions at all. When she returned to the house, the light in Damon's study was still burning, a thin gold line beneath the closed door. She did not knock. Whatever conversation waited behind that door, she was no longer certain she had the strength to have it twice in 1 week, and so she climbed the stairs instead, alone, and let the house settle into its familiar quiet around her. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the estate, sealed with the crest of the Blackridge pack, addressed to her alone. The household staff handed it to her quietly, without comment, though Elena noticed the careful way the young man delivering it avoided her eyes, as if the letter itself carried some weight he did not want to be blamed for passing along. She took it up to her grandmother's old study, the one small room in the house that still felt entirely hers, and sat with it unopened on her lap for a long while before she found the nerve to break the seal. The handwriting inside was neat, controlled, nothing like the easy confidence Kai had carried on the terrace. It read simply that he hoped the whispers following the ball had not made her days harder than they needed to be, that he had not written to cause her further trouble, only to ask whether she might be willing to meet him once, away from both packs and both households, so that whatever had begun between them on that dance floor could be understood properly instead of left to rumor. He signed it only with his name, no titles, no mention of Blackridge, as if for the length of one letter he wanted to be simply a man asking a simple question rather than the air of a rival pack reaching across old, bitter history. Elena read it twice, then a third time, before folding it carefully and pressing it flat beneath the cover of an old book on the shelf behind her, the same shelf where she had once hidden things as a girl that she wasn't ready for anyone else to find. She sat by the window long after the light had gone from the sky, turning the question over in her mind, aware that whatever she decided next would not stay quiet or private for long, not in a world built entirely out of watching eyes and traveling whispers. She did not yet know what she would say to him, but she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she would say something. Damon found the letter a week later, and the house had never felt so small. Elena had not hidden it well enough, or perhaps some part of her had not truly wanted to, tucking it behind a book she rarely opened but never quite putting it out of reach entirely. She was in the garden when she heard him call her name from the study window, his voice pitched in a register she hadn't heard from him in years, not since the early days of their bond, when a lost temper still felt like an event worth noting rather than a familiar weather pattern. She found him standing by the desk with the letter open in his hand, the Blackridge crest catching the afternoon light, his face gone pale and then flushed in the space of a single breath. "What is this?" he asked, though the question was clearly rhetorical, the words already read, already understood, already doing whatever damage they were going to do. "A letter," Elena said, keeping her voice level, "from Kai. I can see who it's from." Damon's hand tightened around the paper, crumpling one edge of it without seeming to notice. "He's asking to meet you, alone." "He's asking," Elena said. "Not demanding. There's a difference." "Is there?" Damon's laugh came out sharp and humorless, nothing like the easy sound she had watched him share with Vera across a crowded ballroom. "You're my mate. The bond between us isn't a suggestion, Elena. It isn't something either of us gets to set aside because we're bored, or hurt, or looking for something new." Elena felt something old and tired rise up in her chest at that, familiar in the way that anger sometimes settles into a person like an old coat, worn soft from repeated use. It steadied her, oddly, the way it always had, a known thing she could reach for when everything else in her felt uncertain. "Bored," she repeated. "Is that what you think this is? Boredom? I don't know what else to call it." "Then let me help you," Elena said, and her voice came out clearer and colder than she expected, cutting through the room like something long overdue. "For 6 months, I lived in a house with a man who came home smelling like someone else's perfume, and I said nothing. I smiled at council dinners. I hosted your friends. I wore the ring you gave me and pretended the weight of it hadn't changed. And you want to stand here and lecture me about what the bond does or doesn't allow, after you paraded that woman in front of the entire pack like she belonged there more than I did." Damon's face had gone very still, the crumpled letter still clutched in his hand, and for a moment Elena thought she saw something crack open behind his eyes, something closer to fear than anger, though he covered it quickly with the same controlled expression he wore in council meetings. "I never meant for you to find out that way," he said. "I never meant for any of it to happen the way it did." "But it did happen," Elena said. "That's the part you keep skipping over. It happened, and I found out, and I said nothing for 6 months, because I thought silence was the price of keeping this family, this pack, this whole life together. And you're standing here angry at me over a single dance and a single letter, as if that's the greater offense." "It's not about the dance," Damon said, his voice rising now, the careful control finally slipping. "It's about him, Kai Thorne. You don't understand what that name means to this pack, what it costs us for you to be seen with him at all." "Then tell me," Elena said again, the same demand she had made on the night of the ball, the same demand he had avoided answering then and clearly intended to avoid answering now. "For once in this marriage, actually tell me something instead of deciding I don't need to know it." Damon set the letter down on the desk with exaggerated care, as if the gentleness of the motion might somehow undo the force of the conversation happening around it. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its heat, replaced by something heavier, something closer to exhaustion. "My father and his father hated each other," he said. "Not the ordinary rivalry between neighboring packs. Something deeper. There was a woman once, generations back, promised to an Ashwood son and taken instead by a Blackridge heir. The wound never healed. Every generation since has been raised to see the other side as the enemy, and I was raised the same way, whether I chose to be or not." "So this is inherited," Elena said slowly. "A hatred you didn't choose, passed down to you like a piece of furniture, nobody wanted, but nobody threw away either. Something like that. And that's supposed to explain why you can bring your mistress to a ball in front of the whole pack, but I can't accept one dance from a man who happened to be kind to me on the worst night of my life." Damon flinched at the word mistress, the first time Elena had used it plainly, without softening it into something gentler. He didn't argue the word. He simply stood there, shoulders lower than she had ever seen them, looking less like the alpha of Ashwood and more like a man who had spent so long managing everyone else's expectations that he had lost track of his own feelings somewhere along the way. "I don't know how to fix this," he said finally. "I don't know how to go back to who we were before any of this happened." "Maybe that's the wrong question," Elena said. "Maybe the question isn't how we go back. Maybe it's whether we even want to." The room went very quiet at that. Quiet enough that Elena could hear the clock ticking on the far wall. Quiet enough that she could hear her own heartbeat, steady and sure in a way it hadn't been in longer than she could remember. Damon looked at her like he wanted to say something that might undo the last several minutes entirely. Some plea or promise large enough to erase 6 months of silence and one crumpled letter sitting between them on the desk. Nothing came. The words simply weren't there, or perhaps he no longer believed in them enough to say them out loud. "Are you going to meet him?" Damon asked instead, quieter now, almost afraid of the answer. Elena thought of the terrace, the warm, steady hand at her waist, the plain honesty that had asked nothing of her except to be honest in return. She thought of Vera's tired voice in the alley behind the post office, admitting she didn't know what to do with what she now understood. She thought of her 17th year, and the choice that had never truly been hers to make, and the 6 months of silence she had carried like a stone in her own chest, because she believed that was what loyalty required. "I don't know yet," she said, and for once it felt less like an evasion and more like the honest truth. "But I know I'm not going to let you decide that for me. Not this time." Damon nodded slowly, something in his posture settling into a kind of resignation Elena hadn't expected from him, a quiet acceptance that the ground beneath their marriage had shifted permanently, whether either of them wanted it to or not. He picked the letter back up from the desk, smoothed the crumpled edge with careful fingers, and held it out to her without another word. Elena took it from him, feeling the strange weight of paper that carried far more inside it than the few sentences written across its surface. She did not thank him. She did not apologize either. She simply folded it once and slipped it into the pocket of her dress, and turned to leave the study, aware that whatever conversation had just taken place between them, it had changed something that could not easily be changed back. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to soften into evening, gold turning slowly toward amber across the wide lawns of the estate, and Elena walked the length of the garden path without any particular destination in mind, simply needing the movement, the air, the space to think without her husband's eyes on her. She thought of the letter in her pocket, of the plain, unhurried request written inside it, and of the strange new steadiness that had settled over her since the night of the ball, as though some old, familiar fear had finally loosened its grip enough to let her breathe. By the time she reached the old stone bench beneath the oak tree, the same bench where she and Nora had traded secrets since childhood, Elena found Nora already there, waiting, as if some instinct between them had known exactly where the day's events would lead her. "You look like someone who just had the fight she's been avoiding for months," Nora said, shifting over to make room on the bench. "Something like that." Elena sat down heavily, the letter still folded in her pocket, its edges pressing faintly against her hip like a small, persistent reminder. "He found the letter." Nora's eyebrows rose. And he told me about his father, and his father before him, and some old wound between Ashwood and Blackridge, that apparently everyone was raised to carry whether they wanted to or not. Elena shook her head slowly. He wanted that to explain everything. The silence, the anger, all of it. Did it? No, Elena said. It explained why he's afraid. It didn't explain why he thought fear gave him the right to decide things for me without ever once asking what I wanted. Nora was quiet for a moment, watching the last of the daylight filter gold through the branches above them, the same tree that had sheltered 100 childhood conversations far simpler than this one. "Do you still love him?" she asked finally, gently, the kind of question only someone who had known Elena since she was small enough to fall out of this very tree could ask without it feeling like an accusation. Elena considered the question honestly, turning it over the way she had turned over so many things in the past several days. "I think I love the idea of who he used to be," she said slowly. "Before the pack meetings multiplied, before the silence became easier than honesty. I don't know if that's the same thing as loving who he is now. That's a hard thing to sit with." "It is," Elena agreed, "but it's better than pretending I don't feel it at all." Nora reached over and squeezed her hand, the same steady grip she had offered days earlier in the kitchen, and for a while neither of them spoke, content to simply sit together beneath the old oak while the evening settled deeper around them, crickets beginning their low chorus somewhere in the grass beyond the garden wall. "Whatever you decide about the letter," Nora said, eventually, Just make sure it's actually your decision, not something you're doing to hurt him back, not something you're doing because you're scared of staying still." Elena thought about that for a long moment, the fading light catching the fold of paper still tucked against her hip. "I don't think I'm trying to hurt him," she said. "I think I'm just tired of being the only person in this marriage who has to ask permission to feel something." Nora nodded slowly and didn't push further, understanding perhaps better than anyone else could that some decisions needed space to breathe, rather than more questions pressed against them. The two of them sat together until the sky had gone fully dark, the first stars appearing faint and scattered above the tree line, and when Nora finally rose to leave, she paused once more beside the bench. "Whatever happens next," she said, "I'm glad you're finally asking the questions instead of just carrying the answers everyone else decided for you." She left Elena alone beneath the oak tree then, the house lights glowing faintly through the darkened garden, and Elena sat a while longer with the letter still folded against her hip, thinking of all the years she had spent believing silence was the same thing as strength. She would answer the letter, not tomorrow, not out of impulse, but soon, deliberately, on her own terms rather than anyone else's. For the first time since she had watched her husband walk through those ballroom doors with another woman on his arm, Elena felt less like a wife waiting for permission and more like a woman finally learning the shape of her own voice. Elena answered the letter 3 days later, in her own handwriting, with no titles and no explanations, simply a place and a time. She chose the old mill at the edge of the river that split the boundary between Ashwood and Blackridge territory, neutral ground in the truest sense, a place neither pack claimed and neither pack watched closely. She had played there as a child, back when the border between the two territories felt less like a wound and more like an ordinary line on a map, and she found some quiet comfort in returning there now, years later, for a conversation that felt anything but ordinary. Kai was already waiting when she arrived, standing near the old wooden wheel that no longer turned, his hands in his pockets, his posture as still and unreadable as it had been on the terrace weeks earlier. He didn't rush toward her, didn't fill the space between them with unnecessary words. He simply waited, patient, as she crossed the last stretch of grass between them. "You came," he said. "I said I would. People don't always keep the promises they make in letters." "I'm not most people," Elena said, and something in his expression shifted, softened, the faint suggestion of a smile that never quite reached his mouth but lived somewhere in his eyes instead. They walked along the riverbank together, slow and unhurried, the water moving low and clear over smooth stones beside them. For a while neither of them spoke, the silence comfortable in a way Elena had almost forgotten silence could be, not the heavy, watchful silence she carried at home, but something lighter, something that asked nothing of her except to simply exist beside another person without performing anything at all. "Damon found your letter," she said eventually. Kai's jaw tightened slightly, the only visible reaction. "I imagined he might. He told me about the history between our families, the old wound. The woman promised to an Ashwood son and taken by a Blackridge heir instead." "Ah," Kai exhaled slowly, looking out over the water rather than at her. "That story. Every generation tells it a little differently, depending on which side is doing the telling. In my family, the woman chose the Blackridge heir freely. In yours, I imagine she was taken. Which version is true? Does it matter anymore?" Kai turned to look at her then, something weary in his expression, despite the youth in his face. "The wound is generations old. Neither of us was there, neither of us chose to inherit it, and yet here we are, still carrying it forward like it belongs to us." Elena thought of her own inheritance, the bond chosen for her at 17, the silence she had carried for 6 months believing it was the price of loyalty. "I understand something about carrying things that were decided before we had any say in them," she said quietly. "I imagine you do." They stopped walking near a wide flat stone at the river's edge, and Elena sat down upon it, feeling the cool stone beneath her palms, the sound of water rushing gently past. Kai remained standing a moment longer before lowering himself down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, careful enough that he left space between them she hadn't asked for, but appreciated all the same. "Why did you write to me?" she asked. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about the way you looked on that terrace," Kai said, plain and unhurried the way he said everything. Not sad, not broken, just tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the ball and everything to do with years of holding something together by yourself. I recognized it. I've worn that same tiredness myself. From what? Kai was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the water moving past them. "My own family expects things of me," he said finally. "A pack expecting its heir to marry strategically, to think only in terms of alliances and borders and old grudges. I've spent most of my life being told what I should want, instead of being asked what I actually do want. I saw that same exhaustion in you the moment you stepped onto that terrace, and I suppose I wanted, selfishly, to know if you'd ever let yourself imagine something different." Elena studied him for a long while, the honesty of his answer settling over her slowly, like the last warmth of the afternoon sun sinking behind the tree line. She had spent years surrounded by careful, managed words, every sentence in her marriage measured for its political weight before it was measured for its truth. Kai's plainness felt almost foreign to her, and entirely welcome. "I don't know what I'm imagining yet," she admitted. "I know I'm not the same woman who walked into that ballroom weeks ago. I know I'm tired of asking permission to feel things, but I don't know if that means I'm ready to choose something entirely new, or if I just needed someone to prove the old thing wasn't the only option." "That's a fair answer," Kai said, without a trace of disappointment in his voice. "I didn't bring you here expecting a decision. I brought you here because I thought you deserved one honest conversation at least, in the middle of everything the rest of the world has turned this into." They sat together by the river a long while longer, talking of smaller things eventually, childhood memories, old stories about the mill and the wheel that no longer turned, the kind of easy conversation that asked nothing large of either of them. Elena found herself laughing, once, at something small Kai said about his mother's strict dancing lessons, a sound that surprised her with how unfamiliar it felt in her own throat, how long it had been since laughter had come without effort behind it. The sun had begun sinking low over the water by the time Elena finally rose to leave, aware that the length of her absence would already be noticed at home, aware that whatever this conversation had been, it would not stay private for long once she returned. Kai rose with her, and for a moment they stood close together beside the old mill wheel, neither of them quite ready to end the quiet they had built. "Whatever you decide," Kai said, "about your marriage, about the bond, about any of it, I want you to decide it, because it's true for you, not because of anything that happened here today." "That's a strange thing for a man to say when he clearly wants a different answer," Elena said, though there was no accusation in it, only honest observation. "I do want a different answer," Kai admitted, without hesitation, without shame, "but I'd rather have the truth from you than a choice made to please me. I've had enough of my own life, shaped by other people's expectations. I won't ask you to build yours the same way." Elena left the mill that evening with more questions than answers, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, the questions felt like her own to carry, rather than a burden placed on her by someone else's decisions. She walked home slowly along the river path, the last light fading into a deep, quiet blue above the trees, turning over everything Kai had said, everything Vera had confessed in that narrow alley, everything Damon had failed to explain until it was almost too late to matter. She found Damon waiting in the study when she returned, the same room where the letter had first come between them, though this time his posture held none of the anger from before, only a tired, resigned stillness that made him look older than she had ever seen him look. "You met him," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I did." "And?" Elena considered how much of the conversation belonged only to her, and how much, if any, Damon still had a right to hear. She settled, finally, on the truth, plain and unhurried, the way Kai had taught her to offer it without softening the edges. "I don't know what I want yet," she said, "but I know I don't want to keep pretending silence is the same thing as peace. I've done that for 6 months, and it nearly cost me the chance to ever ask for anything different." Damon nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on some point past her shoulder, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost the sharp edges of their earlier fight, replaced by something quieter, more honest than she had heard from him in longer than she could remember. "I've been afraid," he admitted, "of losing the pack's respect, of losing control of something I never learned how to hold gently. I used Vera to feel like I still had some choice left in my own life, even though choosing her was never really a choice at all. I see that now. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm just telling you the truth, since you've asked for it so many times and I've given you so little of it in return." Elena listened to him without interrupting, feeling the strange weight of hearing, finally, the honesty she had begged for weeks earlier in this same room. It didn't undo the months of silence. It didn't erase Vera's face across the ballroom, or the crumpled letter, or the quiet ache that had settled permanently into the space where trust used to live between them. But it was something, a small, late offering, and Elena found she could accept it, without needing it to fix everything at once. "What happens now?" Damon asked quietly. "I don't know yet," Elena said again, and this time the words felt less like an evasion and more like an honest map of where she actually stood, somewhere between the marriage she had built out of duty and silence, and whatever new thing waited for her on the far side of the river, patient, unhurried, and entirely her own to choose or refuse. She did not decide that night, and she did not decide the following week either, though the whispers around the pack slowly quieted as no new scandal arrived to feed them, replaced instead by smaller, ordinary gossip about harvests and weddings, and the usual small dramas of pack life. The senior council summoned Damon twice more in the following weeks, each time pressing him harder about what the dance and the letter and the ongoing silence between him and his mate might mean for the fragile peace between Ashwood and Blackridge. Elena was not present for those meetings, but Nora, ever resourceful, brought back enough details for her to understand the shape of the pressure Damon now carried, an alpha caught between old inherited hatreds and a marriage he had nearly let slip through his own carelessness. "They want him to make a statement," Nora told her one afternoon, the two of them shelling peas together on the back porch, an ordinary task that made the extraordinary conversation feel almost bearable. "Something to reassure the pack that Ashwood hasn't gone soft toward Blackridge. Some of the older wolves are talking as if a single dance was an act of war." "It was a dance," Elena said, "not for the first time, a kind one, offered on the worst night of my life. I know that. You know that. Try telling it to a council of wolves who've spent their whole lives guarding a grudge older than any of us." Nora shook her head, dropping a handful of pods into the basket between them. "For what it's worth, Damon hasn't given them the statement they wanted. He told them the matter was private, between him and his mate, and none of their concern." Elena looked up at that, surprised. "He said that?" "According to my sources, word for word." Nora's mouth curved into something between a smile and a shrug. "Maybe honesty suits him better than he thought it would. It was a small thing, that single act of protection, but Elena found it settled somewhere gently inside her. Not enough to erase 6 months of silence. Not enough to undo the ache that still lived in the space where trust used to sit easily between them, but enough to remind her that people were rarely made of only their worst decisions. Damon had failed her in ways that would take a long while yet to fully understand, but he was also, still, capable of choosing her over the easier, safer path the council preferred. Vera left the territory before the month was out, quietly, without ceremony, taking with her whatever future she had once imagined for herself alongside Damon. Elena and Damon lived for a while longer in the same house, in a careful, honest kind of distance neither of them had known how to build before, one made of real conversations instead of managed silence, one that left room for the possibility that the bond between them might heal into something different, smaller perhaps, or might simply run its course toward an ending neither of them wanted to rush. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the ache of old habits grew too loud to sit with, Elena walked the path down to the old mill by the river, where she would occasionally find Kai waiting, patient as ever, asking nothing of her except the truth of whatever she carried that day. On one such evening, weeks after the strange, quiet unraveling that had begun with a single dance, Elena found him sitting on the same flat stone at the river's edge, watching the current move steadily past in the fading light. He didn't ask why she had come, and she didn't offer an explanation, simply sitting down beside him the way she had the first time, close enough to feel the quiet warmth of him, far enough to leave the choice of what came next entirely open. "The council still watches every move Ashwood makes near Blackridge Land," she said eventually. "Even peaceful ones, especially peaceful ones. Some things take longer to unlearn than others," Kai said. "Old fear moves slower than old anger. It has deeper roots. Do you think it will ever be different? Between our packs, I mean." Kai considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things, without rushing toward an easy answer simply to fill the silence. "I think it changes one honest conversation at a time," he said finally, "the same way most things worth changing do. Slowly, and usually starting smaller than anyone expects." Elena thought of the letter folded once and tucked into an old book, of the crumpled paper in Damon's hand, of Vera's tired voice in a narrow alley admitting she didn't know what to do with the truth once she finally had it. Small, honest conversations, each one changing the shape of something larger than itself, one careful word at a time. "I'm not ready to promise you anything," she said quietly, watching the water move steadily past the smooth stones beneath them. "Not the way people usually mean when they make promises." "I haven't asked you for one," Kai said. "I told you before, I'd rather have your truth than a decision made to please anyone, including me." "Then here is my truth," Elena said, turning to look at him fully, for the first time since she'd sat down. "I don't know yet where any of this leads. But I know that sitting here, by this river, saying exactly what I mean without managing it for anyone else's comfort, feels more like my own life than anything I've felt in years." Kai's expression softened at that, something quiet and unguarded passing across his face before he looked back out toward the water. "Then that's enough for tonight," he said. "More than enough." They sat together until the last light had gone fully from the sky, the current moving on steadily beneath them, the way it always had, indifferent to old grudges and new beginnings alike, simply continuing forward the only way a river ever truly knows how. She did not know, even months later, exactly where her life was headed, whether toward the marriage she had spent years building out of loyalty and silence, or toward something new and uncertain waiting patiently by the water. But for the first time since she had watched her husband walk through those ballroom doors with another woman on his arm, Elena understood that the choice, whatever it eventually became, would finally be hers to make.